Good evening, everyone. If anyone doesn't know me, I'm Rabbi Susan Nanis. I'm Director of Adult Programs at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and I am so excited. This is our first in-person adult event, I think, in 3 years. It's been a long and I think more people will come in because we had about 60 people register, so they'll probably trickle in, but we want to begin. And we have done this every 4 years. We did it with you, Dan, 4 years ago, I think.
4 years before that.
And 4 years before that. Is that right? Wow. So, because what's on the ballot? I have a big problem. I don't know the judges. I don't know what the propositions really mean. I want to know what's going on. There's all this backstory and things we don't really know, and it's really helpful to have that. So we have Dan Schnur, who's also a member of our temple, but he's a professor of communications, of public policy. He's taught at Harvard, at USC. Right now he's teaching at USC and at Berkeley. He's done many other things, and he's going to introduce our other two amazing guests, Elex Michaelson and Cagle, in a moment. I just want to let you know that next Wednesday we're also having another incredible program with Ben Freeman, who is a young British Jew who started this whole Jewish pride movement in the face of anti-Semitism, both on the ground and in the media. He's written an incredible book called Jewish Pride, and he will be here next Wednesday night, and he's actually started this Jewish Pride movement, which is very important, giving us tools and information about how to stand up, what to say, how to respond to the anti-Semitism that's proliferating in our country right now. And one last thing, on November 13th in our sanctuary at the Glazer campus will be a magnificent concert by the Colburn School of Music entitled Recovered Voices, and it will be music, beautiful music, with an ensemble of 8 musicians. These musicians, some of them are playing violins that are 300 years old, because I've heard them. Music of composers who either died or their careers were totally destroyed by the Holocaust. So and many of them were quite young, in their 20s and early 30s, and their music was magnificent, so we invite you to that concert. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dan, who will introduce our...
Well, Susan, thank you so much. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us for the return of in-person programming at Wilshire Boulevard. Like all of you, I've really missed this programming over the last few years. And while I know I've had the opportunity to talk with or at some of you on Zoom over that time period, it's sort of nice seeing an audience with arms and legs again. So I'm glad you're all here. So as Susan mentioned, I've had the great privilege of being part of these programs for many, many years. The first one I did was actually with Dick Reardon many years ago. Since then, I've done these types of programs before the election with our late friend Bill Rosendahl, with Zev Yaroslavsky, with Bob Hertzberg, with Conan Nolan, with Alex Nolan, with Alex Cohen, so many people who we know and respect in the communities of politics and policy and journalism here in Los Angeles. But I will tell you, and I'm not just shining them on, I've never been happier to be joined on a stage by 2 guests than I am today. Because Kate Cagle, who is an anchor and reporter for Spectrum News 1 here in Los Angeles, and Elex Michaelson, who's an anchor and reporter for Channel 11 here in LA, before they became big and important and famous television and journalism stars, they were both students in my class at the University of Southern California. And so you should give them a very enthusiastic round of applause, not just for the extraordinary journalism they both do every day for the people of Los Angeles, but because they both managed to survive my class and actually
Very nice. Dan is such a great professor, and I'm not just saying that because he's sitting next to me, but he was, for me, my favorite professor at USC. Do we have any Trojans in the house? Anybody, any USC grads here?
Oh no.
Nobody? Nobody.
Tough crowd for us.
Any Bruins in the house? Any Bruins? What about Berkeley people? Anybody from Berkeley? Any of his, now you're a Harvard guy too? You're teaching at Harvard? Any Harvard people in the house? Yale. Okay, Ivy League all the way. All right. I'm surprised no Trojans, but that's okay.
So really quickly, and then we will jump in, for the Bruins in the room who feel a little bit slighted by this stage full of Trojans, I'm going to share a little known fact, but a true fact about the state of California that you may not know. I learned this from the former Governor Gray Davis, and it's still the case today. Because there's such a larger population in Southern California than in Northern California, if you were going to draw a line to divide the state of California in half, but to divide the state not by geography, not by square miles, but by population, so that 20 million people were to the south of that line and 20 million people to the north of that line, you would not draw that line through Santa Barbara, you would not draw that line through Fresno or Bakersfield. You would draw that line, no lie, right through downtown Los Angeles. And in fact, you would draw that line right down Wilshire Boulevard. Which means for all of my UCLA friends in the room, as far as I'm concerned, you all went to one of the finest universities in Northern California. So we shouldn't have any problem at all bring it up with Stanford. Let's talk some politics. So originally when we planned this program, and originally when Kate and Alex were gracious enough to give time out of their very busy schedules to be with us, we knew, of course, we'd want to talk about the Los Angeles mayor's race. We knew, of course, we'd want to talk about the other city elections. We knew that we'd want to talk about the state ballot initiatives. We knew that we'd want to talk about the fight for control of Congress. But what we couldn't have anticipated until about 10 days ago is that the city of Los Angeles, not just our political landscape, but our entire city, has been roiled by an extraordinary controversy and an exposing of a whole range of racial tensions that we all knew exist, but I don't want to speak for others here. But at least I felt that we were making much greater progress toward addressing and resolving than in fact was the case. So although this is primarily still a conversation about the elections, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the landscape on which these elections are taking place. And since the audio tape became public just a week ago Sunday, just 11 days ago, of 3 members of our city council and an influential union leader talking in what I think most of us would agree are unforgivable terms about our fellow Angelenos, it really has caused not just a great deal of anger and consternation, but a lot of self-reflection and questioning about where we are as a community and how we can move forward. We're extremely lucky because as much as Alex and Kate know about the elections at all 3 levels, they've been covering this story more closely than any other journalist in the city, if not in the country. And so what I'm going to do first for us to get started is, Kate, I'm going to ask you if you can give us a brief overview of where the story stands right now. We know that Council President Martinez has resigned. We know that Council members De Leon and Cedillos are resisting pressure to step down. Can you give us an overview of where the story stands right now?
Yeah, well, first I'll just say thank you so much for hosting this and for having Alex and I tonight. It's so nice to be in community with people and in person, like you said, seeing faces and arms and legs and actual people in a room. It just always warms my heart. It doesn't get old anymore. And yeah, I think my count is we are on day 12 of this scandal and everyone basically working around the clock at this point. And the biggest development, we'll just start with the lead, is that Kevin De Leon, the council member, has begun his apology tour. So yesterday he gave his first interview. Everyone now, of course, paying attention to the careful selection process that the councilman is making right now. So he spoke to Univision and he spoke to CBS's Tom Waite. He gave these heartfelt interviews where he said he was very sorry, but that he was framing it that it would be selfish for him to step down because the community wouldn't have representation, which we've already seen Nuri Martinez step down. What the council has done is immediately they put what they call a caretaker in her place, And this week it went before the city council already to start the process of scheduling a special election next year to fill that seat with a new voting member. So I think that he's gonna get a lot of pushback once he starts doing more media interviews. His office has still not texted me back, so I have not had a chance to ask him any questions, but he says that he is going to try to continue to work, to do the job, but there are a lot of questions about how he can show up to council, right? This is LA's legislative body, there's 15 members. Every single member has called on him and Councilman Gil Cedillo to resign. Councilman Mike Bonin, whose Black adopted son was at the center of the vitriol, has said that he cannot sit in the same room as Kevin DeLeon, much less on the dais. What has happened before was last week, Kevin DeLeon and Gil Cedillo did try to attend a meeting to the shock and appall of their colleagues and everyone in the room. I was at City Hall that day, and there was absolute uproar from the crowd that was in the chambers, and the acting president at the time, Mitch O'Farrell, actually came over and asked them to leave. And I asked what the plan was for this week, and Mitch O'Farrell, when he was president, he was having behind the scenes conversations with their staff saying they need to not show up for votes, which they haven't. We have a new president to keep everyone up. Everything has been changing every day. His name is Paul Krikorian. So now the ball is in his court because there is no actual mechanism for the city council to force them to resign. The city charter only allows them to suspend a council member if they're actually indicted or facing charges. So far there has been talk, there is an attorney general investigation into whether anything illegal actually happened. There's been questions on whether or not they might have violated the Brown Act, but it doesn't seem like anyone is moving particularly quickly to actually bring charges if they believe that they did something illegal. So the story's changing every day. There's a big question about how LA city government can continue to function right now with these two council members who are refusing to resign. And as you spoke, you know, we all have our ballots in hand, and while none of these folks are actually listed on the ballot, I think it has been a complete earthquake, political earthquake, and how people are thinking about local government and elections right now.
And let's come back in just a minute and talk about how this controversy is affecting the local political landscape and elections. But you said something really interesting, which I don't think I knew, or if I read, I didn't remember it, is that the council president actually asked council members De Leon and Cedillo not to come to the meeting. I find to be very, very interesting, recognizing that city government was not going to be able to function with the two of them present. Alex, I'm going to ask you this, and we're going to come back to the politics in just a second. But obviously this affects a lot more than just 15 members of the city council. It affects the entire city, all of the communities that make up this incredibly diverse community of Los Angeles. You've just come from a town hall meeting that you put together and helped oversee, in which several of our city's political leaders talked about the steps forward. What do you see going forward in coming out of this controversy?
Well, I mean, one of the questions is, will they or will they not resign? Gil Cedillo is going to be off the council in a matter of weeks anyways. He lost his re-election bid, so in December, he's off the council. Whether he resigns ahead of that, who knows? Marquise Harris Dawson, who's one of the members of the city council who was on our town hall, said to us during this event that was just on Fox 11, which if you want to watch is on YouTube and foxla.com if you want to watch it later. It was really interesting. He said that on Friday, he said to Gil, he said, come to a black church with me this weekend. If you're really interested in saying sorry and listening to what people have to say, come say sorry to people's faces. And you've been with me for years to church, come to church with me. And Gil said, no, wasn't ready for that. And we haven't really heard much from him. Kevin De Leon is now clearly on his apology tour. Gil Cedillo hasn't said much. So what happens with De Leon is an open question. One thing that seems like will probably happen is a reformation of the redistricting process. Remember, this conversation was all about who draws the lines for council districts. In the state of California, it is an independent redistricting commission, which is an old Schwarzenegger reform. California is sort of leading the way on. It's a group of Democrats, Republicans, independents who are not connected to the people in power, and go through this very transparent, sort of messy, but still independent process of drawing the lines. The idea being to get the partisan politics out of it. That's not the case for the city of Los Angeles right now. The members of the council draw their own lines and pick their own voters, not the other way around. That's why there was so much animosity on that tape, talking about who is going to be my voter, where the money is, who gets the power, all that stuff. So there's a push now in 2024 to have a ballot measure that would create an independent redistricting commission for the city of Los Angeles. Seems like that would probably get the votes right now based off of where things are at. There may be a push to even do something like that sooner if they can internally on the council, but that seems to be one push that probably is going to get a lot of bipartisan support. Or it doesn't really matter if it gets bipartisan support in Los Angeles, it's 60% are Democrats, so if Democrats are behind it, it passes. Another push, potentially, and this one is more controversial, is the idea of whether the city council should be expanded, whether 15 people is enough to represent a city of 4 million. Some people, including Mike Fuhr, who I talked to at an event earlier today, says this is great. This is something he tried to do when he was mayor. This idea that you don't get enough representation with this, and you don't have people that are necessarily meeting your needs. Others, including Karen Bass, who I talked to about this a few days ago, could be mayor, doesn't like the idea. She thinks what you could end up having happen is that you get disproportionately poor districts that have no assets and no power, and then you end up disenfranchising people more. So that doesn't seem to have the votes yet, but that will probably be discussed going forward, those two issues. Should the council be bigger, and who should draw the districts?
Well, two fascinating issues. As somebody who ran political campaigns in my earlier years, I'm not sure I'd want to try, although I certainly see the benefits, as Mike Fuhr talks about, of having a larger council. I'm not sure I'd want to run the campaign trying to convince voters in Los Angeles or anywhere else the answer to their city's problems is more politicians.
Yeah, and more members of the LA City Council.
Exactly. And on redistricting, if I can take off the moderator's hat for a minute, Alex, I think
you can do whatever you want. I think you're in charge here.
I think it's long overdue. I've always said that letting politicians draw their own districts is like letting teenagers set their own curfews. Even if they start out with the best of intentions, the hour gets late and bad things happen, and we're seeing the end results of that right now. Kate, you wanted to weigh in again.
Yeah, I would just say that there's so much focus on the mayor's race, but I'm sure everyone in this room knows, like, your city council member is an incredibly powerful person in your life in Los Angeles. How the homelessness is dealt with in your district, how police respond to crime in your district, and then those fixing potholes, street lights, sidewalks. I mean, that's your city council member. So it's been interesting just to watch this focus go back to the council. It's also LA's legislative body. So who becomes the next council president is huge for Los Angeles and huge for whomever you elect as the next mayor, as the city elects. They're gonna have to work with that person to actually get their agenda done.
And that's a great point, because as I know most of you, if not all of you know, Los Angeles has what's known as a weak mayor system. And that's not a criticism of Eric Garcetti or any of his predecessors. But the way the city charter is structured is the mayor of Los Angeles has much less power and much less authority than their counterparts in other large cities around the country, which makes, as Kate correctly said, makes the council even more important. Now, we are going to make sure there's time toward the end of tonight's program for questions from as many of you as possible. And hopefully there'll be time to talk about some of those individual council races, should you care to. But I do want to talk for a few minutes before we move on to state and national politics to talk about the campaign for mayor of Los Angeles, because it is attracting such an extraordinary amount of attention. Now, Kate, Alex, I remember right after the primary, the LA Times UC Berkeley poll showed that Karen Bass had an immense lead in the polls, a double-digit lead and more than a 20-point lead among likely voters. By the end of the summer, that lead had shrunk and the race had become fairly close among all voters, but Bass still enjoyed a lead of double digits, of more than 10 points, among the most likely voters. This week, there's a poll out from the LA Daily News that shows the race virtually even. So I'm certainly not going to ask either of you to predict what's going to happen, but it does seem, the one thing we know about watching polls is that even though polls don't necessarily predict outcomes, what we learn is to watch the trajectory of public polling. So for example, if I'm running against Susan for office and the poll shows that I'm 5 points behind, we don't really know if I'm ahead or behind. But if the poll last month showed that I was 10 points behind and the month before that showed that I was 15 points behind, that means we can see the trend going in my direction. So it seems like the trending is in Caruso's direction. What I'd ask you first, Alex, and then Kate, is give us an overview of where the race stands and what we should be looking for in the closing days before the vote.
Well, you're going to look for a lot of ads from Rick Caruso. I don't know if you've seen
won't be
that.
able to miss
Have you
them.
noticed that so far? Rick Caruso spending $80 million on this race, which is quite something. And now that it looks like he could win, maybe that number goes up again. I mean, look, this race, I think what we don't know is how this City Hall controversy impacts the mayor's race, if at all. Interestingly, in our town hall, we asked the question to a bunch of voters, does that change the way you vote? And nobody raised their hand. I'll do that here. Anybody here, does what happened with LA City Hall, with Nuri and everybody else, does that change your perspective about voting for mayor of Los Angeles? Anybody raise your hand? It does for you, Rabbi. How so?
I feel like, to be frank, a wealthy billionaire cannot possibly understand the struggles and challenges of the minorities in this city, and we need someone who understands that, and it's also time for a woman mayor in Los Angeles.
So were you pro Caruso before this?
I actually voted for him, I don't know why, in the primary.
You did?
I was
Interesting.
kind of, I don't know, thinking like what's his name in New York?
Mike Bloomberg.
Yeah, Bloomberg type, but after this, I just don't think Rich White Man has a clue. And I don't think he'll be a good mayor.
Well, as a white guy up here, I'm not going to take any offense, but yeah, your comments. Yeah, I'm not a billionaire, that's for sure. Yeah.
I feel the exact opposite.
Yeah.
My feeling is I don't want more of the same old.
Right.
And I think that's what we had. So I knew where I was going even before we got them 12 days ago. This solidifies.
And if I may, Alex, this is really interesting. What we're hearing from these two individuals is an almost ideal representation of the debate that's going on across the city of Los Angeles. And what I'd suggest to you is a week ago Saturday, the day before these tapes became public, Karen Bass was running as a voice of experience, someone who was not just experienced in politics and government, but who'd worked in our communities, founding an organization designed to improve relationships between those communities. Whereas Caruso was running as a voice of change, someone who said, I can make City Hall and city government work better. What I hear right here, and I've heard throughout the city over the last week and a half, is very few people changing their mind, but the things that brought them to their candidates, their respective candidates to begin with, either someone with experience from inside government in the community, we need that now more than ever given this controversy, or alternatively, an outsider bringing a fresh perspective, we need that even more because of this. So
Right.
Alex, it sounds like this isn't changing people's minds, but it's intensifying their feelings.
Well, and if it encourages more people to vote, according to the polls, that's probably good for Caruso. Because if you looked at some of that LA Times polling, it showed that among what they called likely voters, Bass had a bigger lead, but among all voters, Caruso was much closer. Me thinking that a lot of people that don't traditionally vote might not vote in this race, but if more people are now excited to get out and vote, that could be an advantage to him. I mean, look, he's got the harder job, right? I mean, at the end of the day, LA is a Democratic city. 60% of Los Angeles, of the city of Los Angeles, the 4 million people in the city of Los Angeles, are Democrats. There's no doubt that Karen Bass is the Democratic choice. She's a lifelong Democrat. She's endorsed by the president, the vice president, the almost president, the Speaker of the House. I mean, everybody in the state, with the exception of Gavin Newsom, who's friends with Rick Caruso, and his campaign manager is running Rick Caruso's campaign. But besides that, like, Karen Bass is the establishment Democratic choice. She's endorsed by almost all of the city council. So Caruso's got a job that's harder, which is to convince Democratic voters to vote against the Democratic choice, to vote against the candidate who's endorsed by most of the people that they voted for the last 20 years, are all saying back this person. But Caruso's also got the advantage of saying the city sucks right now. And there's a lot of Democrats who have voted for all those people who feel like, yeah, it does. I'm sick of homeless people in front of my house. I'm sick of the crime. I'm sick of this situation the way it is. And maybe the situation isn't going great. And maybe I'm ready for something new. But to still make that leap, I mean, for some people it almost feels like cheating on their wife, you know? Like the idea that, like, I'm a Democrat, and to make that leap is tough. Clearly Caruso's convinced a lot of people to do that, but can he get to 50%? Can he get to 50% plus one? There has not been a demonstration so far that he can, and getting that last 4 or 5% to win this thing may be a Mount Everest for him, but God knows he's trying, and he's putting in all the money to possibly do it.
So that First Times poll after the election also asked people what they thought about Mayor Garcetti's time in office. And what was interesting is the percentage of voters who thought that Garcetti has done a good job as mayor was absolutely identical to the percentage of voters who were supporting Karen Bass. And those who thought that Garcetti had not done a good job as mayor was exactly the same percentage as those supporting Caruso. So Kate, the question I'd ask you is, under normal circumstances, it seems to me, a candidate like Caruso, as Alex was hinting at, wouldn't have a chance. But such is voter dissatisfaction on issues of crime and public safety and homelessness that it's turned the political landscape into a much different kind of thing. What do you see as you cover this race?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting discussion to have, because after we saw the primary results eventually come in, right, we still have this kind of red mirage phenomenon, which I would caution everyone to look out for on election night, right? Like, more conservative voters, even more conservative Democrats, tend to vote early, vote in that vote total. More liberal, more progressive voters tend to vote on election day, and you can send in your ballot up on election day. It has to get there in the mail. So we were watching that shift that went from, it looked like Caruso did very well in the primary, up to a week later it was like, is he really going to be able to pull it off in the general, when there's going to be a broader electorate that will be even more progressive than what we saw in the primary? But as Alex said, he has blanketed the airwaves. Everyone knows that he's running. I love to go to my mommy groups and get the check-in with them, and everyone knows about Rick Caruso. They've gotten the mailers, they've seen the commercials. So it's been really interesting, but I keep coming back this whole discussion to a press event that Alex and I were both at in the Valley, and State Senator Alex Padilla was there, and Nuri Martinez, and Karen Bass. And it was a rally for Karen Bass in the Valley because Caruso had done really well in the San Fernando Valley in the primary, and particularly with Latino voters. So Bass did this event with Nuri Martinez to try to get her voters on her side. So it's very interesting now, here we are months later, Nuri Martinez is one of the most disgraced politicians in Los Angeles right now, and this coalition that Bass had been trying to build, it'll be really interesting to see how all of it plays out.
And the smart money says that this race is going to come down to who do Latinos support and what happens in the San Fernando
Right.
Valley. And in that case, it is both Latinos in the San Fernando Valley. And so what Caruso has done this time around, which he didn't do in the spring, they feel like their big mistake was not investing enough money in voter outreach, in literally taking people to the polls. And so he's spent at least $10 million, if not more, in knocking on doors, in making sure people have their ballots, in like literally going to communities that never have had anybody show up before, and to try to get those people to actually vote. Not just blanket the airway with TV promotion, but to actually go out there in terms of a field operation. Could that make a difference? And a point that Kate made, which is a good one, is the most likely outcome at this point, a few weeks out from the race, is that we don't know who the winner of the mayor's race is going to be on election night. That it could be weeks before we know who the winner of the mayor's race is. And a point today, I was at an event with a lot of top city leaders who were saying what's especially concerning about that is the mayor's supposed to take over at the beginning of December. So the new mayor may only end up with like 2 or 3 weeks max to even transition into the new job.
So we could very easily spend the rest of our time here today and several more hours just on the mayor's race.
That's the most interesting race.
It is Caruso's support among Latino and Asian Pacific voters, Bass's support on the west side. The dynamic of voter turnout, which generally favors the more conservative candidate, now seems to be playing in the other direction. But we have an obligation here, because when we presented this program to all of you, we said we were going to talk about not only local politics, but state and national politics as well. So we started a little bit late, so we'll go a little bit past our ending time. But what I'm going to ask each of you to do, if you can, is rather than us going through each of the initiatives, and if people have questions about a particular one, we're happy to answer them. But what I'd ask each of you, first Kate and then Alex, of the 7 initiatives on the statewide ballot, is there anything in particular that has caught your attention? Or has the local controversy just so focused our attention in that direction? Actually, either of you. Alex?
Well, okay, before I do that, I'm going to take one moment for a shameless self-promotional opportunity, if you don't mind. Since I'm not getting paid to be here, I'll do a self-promo. I've been working on really hard for the last week something on the mayor's race, which I think is unlike anything that anybody's done before, and I hope you'll check it out. We sat down with both Rick Caruso and Karen Bass and their kids, and it was the first time that their family members had ever done interviews in this race. And we got to the core of who they are. We went with Karen Bass to the Community Coalition, which is what she founded in South LA. We went with Rick Caruso to this school that he supported for decades in Watts. And all of them opened up, all of them cried, all of them got personal and in a different way than I'd ever seen. And I think you really get a sense of who they are as people in a different way. And that's on tomorrow night at 10:30 on my show called The Issue Is, and I hope you'll check it out. Okay.
And in total fairness, Kate, please give a shameless plug.
Yeah, do you want a shameless plug?
Oh, well, my baby in this race is all about the LA County Sheriff. So that is really what I've been diving into. I mean, Sheriff Alex Villanueva, probably one of the most controversial leaders in LA County right now. A lot of people watching that race, and kind of this no-name former chief of police in Long Beach, Robert Luna, trying to take him on and really bring change to that department. So I'll plug my show, Sunday at 5 o'clock. We'll be talking about that. And both their it's jumping off of the racism scandal in City Hall, where both of them have called on these council members to resign, but both of them have faced, really horrendous allegations about systemic racism, anti-black bias in their own departments. So it's kind of exploring policing and examining their ability to bring actual real change.
Dan, I'm reminded that I had a professor once that taught me the strategy of answer the question you wish you were asked instead of answering the question you were asked. So I blame you for that. But to answer your actual question, things to look for in terms of propositions. Prop 1, which is enshrining abortion rights into the Constitution of California. Most likely going to pass, but going to get national attention. Gavin Newsom is spending some of his own campaign funds for this because he thinks this is smart politics for him as he tries to run for president. Another thing, two things to look at, sports betting in California. You've probably seen those ads, right? Over $400 million spent on these ads. Prop 26 would legalize sports betting in Indian casinos only. Prop 27 would allow sports betting on your phone or on your computer. You don't have to be at a India casino. You just have to basically have a mobile device. The tribes have spent a lot. FanDuel, MLB, other places have spent a lot. Polls show that both of those things are going down big time. So much so that they're starting to pull back on some of this funding on that. But you know, if they both lose, which is probably what's going to happen, there'll be a big debate over what happens with sports betting. Another thing to look at is Prop 30. You've seen Governor Newsom jump on this one. He's saying no to Prop 30. This is a tax that would be on millionaires that would raise money for certain climate goals. It's something that Lyft is very much in favor of and are the biggest donors to. A lot of environmental groups like it, but then a lot of, frankly, wealthy people don't. And then it's been interesting to see Gavin Newsom's involvement in being against it has really driven up the no number quite a bit. And so that one, I think, is still close. It's not clear exactly where it's going to go.
And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow up real quickly on those, because I agree with Alex that those are the initiatives most worth watching. And Kate, if it's okay with you, let me do a quick follow-up, and then would like to turn to you to begin our congressional conversation, if that's okay.
Lovely.
Okay, so to follow up on Alex's last point about Proposition 30, she said a tax on wealthy people to pay for a range of climate change initiatives, most notably a dramatic expansion in the availability of electric vehicles in California. Now, Newsom, since taking office, has been a very aggressive fighter to implement measures to push back against climate change. But now all of a sudden he's come out against this initiative, even though it's being supported by the California Democratic Party in most environmental initiatives. And the reason for that is that Newsom is very, very aware and very, very worried about the state heading into a recession. Because California, as I think many of you know, has an extremely progressive income tax. A very small number of very wealthy taxpayers pay an overwhelming majority of the state's income tax. And so that's where our revenue comes from. And what that means, because working class people pay taxes on wages, wealthier people tend to pay taxes on capital gains, on stack earnings. So when the stock market drops even a little bit, the amount of revenue coming into the state budget drops precipitously. And one of the biggest problems that Governors Brown and Schwarzenegger and Davis and Wilson all faced was relatively minor recessions, but because of the drop in the stock market, it caused huge budget deficits. If you're a governor of either party, Democrat or Republican, the best political gift you can have is a budget surplus. Because you can implement spending programs, you can cut taxes, people are going to love you. The worst thing for any governor is to have a big budget deficit. That means raising taxes. That means cutting spending. And on the off chance that our governor might run for president someday, that's not the way he wants to spend his second term in office. So his concern, it's not that he's not concerned about climate change, it's that he's even worried more about the immediate economic and budgetary impact on the state, because he doesn't want us to go through the same kind of cuts as we did several years ago. On Prop 1, real quickly, this initiative, an initiative on whether to codify abortion rights in California, not that hard to pass. Should we give ice cream to orphans? That would pass by less money than a pro-choice ballot initiative. So why is it on the ballot? Because Democrats understand that while Governor Newsom and Senator Padilla will be elected by very safe margins, they have very seriously contested campaigns for state legislature and for Congress. And their concern is that if a Democratic voter does not see a contested race for governor or Senate, they might not vote. And that could cost them seats in the legislature and in Congress. So by putting an initiative on the ballot to remind California voters which party stands for reproductive rights is not just an important message to send, but an extremely important get out the vote tool, particularly when the Democratic Party is fighting as hard as it is to maintain its very slim majorities in Congress. Kate, speaking of very slim majorities in Congress, why don't we switch the conversation now before we wrap up to the federal level and the fight for control of the House and the Senate. Tell us what you see there.
Yeah, I just wanted to, one tidbit about what you said. In the lead up to the primaries, I had lunch with a political insider who was running multiple local campaigns, and he'd done a lot of polling, and he was like, hey, can we just meet, and can I just tell you what voters are telling us? You know, we do these polls behind the scenes to kind of see what's testing well. And he said the most popular person in all of Los Angeles is Planned Parenthood. That behind the scenes, nothing was polling more positively than Planned Parenthood, and he was going to plaster it all over the websites of all of his candidates that was a huge issue. So it's great that you talked about that Proposition 1. I mean, I think all eyes are really on the rematch between Mike Garcia and Christy Smith. I think that's a huge one. You know, talking about changing demographics, talking about energizing your base to come out. I haven't seen any recent polling. I don't know if you guys have for that race to show how they're doing.
They both say that they're doing well in their internal polling, so.
Right. Similar story. So
This was a race, by the way, last time around was the closest congressional race in the country. 333 votes separated the two of them. This was one of those races that went for weeks without knowing who it would be. The district was redistricted. It's actually more Democratic, but Mike Garcia is more popular than he was then, so it's unclear who's going to win. So.
No, I think that's great. It's super fascinating. Like, I don't cover as much of the congressional races. For us, that's really the Orange County reporters, because I'm really in LA, but it's really focusing on those Orange County purple races that have been flipping back and forth, red to blue. So I know there's going to be a lot of tension there.
Yeah, and Christy Smith, by the way, will be on the Fox 11 News special report tomorrow night at 6 o'clock.
That's 3
Mike
plugs.
Garcia was on last week, if you want to hear more about that race.
So we owe you 2 plugs before we wrap up
All
here
right.
and even things out. And I will say for the record that on election night, I'll be doing commentary both on Channel 11 and on Spectrum.
Yes.
So you can see
There you
where,
go.
where my loyalties lie. Okay, what we're going to do is we just want to wrap up on Congress real quick. And then Kate, I know you wanted to make a point about the changes in the judicial races before we go to your questions. We started at about 7:45, so we will go a little bit long, but we really do want to make sure we have a chance to hear from all of you. So the congressional race that Alex and Kate are talking about up on the LA-Ventura County border is one of about half a dozen campaigns in California that even a deep blue state like ours are 2 very, very closely contested races between the Democratic and the Republican nominees. And given the Democrats' having such a tenuous hold on their House majority, just a handful of seats, and given a 50-50 tie in the Senate, most of not just California, but the entire country, by the time the polls close out here, are going to be watching those last half a dozen California races because they could end up affecting control of Congress. Now, if any of you would like in questions, we're more than happy to dig into particular races.
Oh, yeah.
But I'll offer you one broader observation, then Alex, if you'd like to add to it, of course, I'd love you to. Presidential campaigns are about persuasion. What presidential candidates do in a general election is they try to convince undecided voters to move in one direction or the other. Midterm elections, because there's lower voter turnout, there's no persuasion going on at all. What the campaigns do, instead of trying to persuade undecided voters, is they spend their time and money trying to motivate their own most loyal supporters. And so what we have now are essentially 2 parallel campaigns going on. One campaign in which Republicans are telling their most loyal supporters that the most important issues in this country right now are inflation and crime. And they should go to vote on those issues.
And the border.
Democrats are telling their most loyal supporters that the most important issue in this country by far right now is abortion rights, and to some extent gun violence. And so instead of having campaigns debating over the issues back and forth, you have both campaigns talking to their most loyal supporters, trying to get them excited enough about their own issue, whether it be inflation or abortion, whether it be criminal justice or gun violence, to see who can turn out their bases more. And so if it doesn't seem like the candidates are talking at each other, if it seems like they're talking past each other, that's because they are. Because they know that the way to win a midterm election is to get their own base as excited as possible. Alex, I do want to allow Kate, and if you would like to also to offer a quick overview on the judges. But on the fight for Congress and Senate, you've watched this so carefully. What else should we be thinking about?
Well, I think just to pick up on the point you just made, I think that's a reason why a lot of them have not agreed to do debates. Because I've tried to organize debates with the Mike Garcia, Christy Smith race. Christy Smith said yes, Mike Garcia said no. I've tried to do debates with some of the Orange County races that are close. And Democrats don't want to talk about crime and inflation. And Republicans don't want to talk about abortion. They changed the issue. So why have the debate where they're going to be forced to engage on it? Just talk to their supporters in social media, and you don't have to go about it. I think it's really bad for democracy. It's terrible what's happening, you know, that the governor and the attorney general and all these people say no to debates, but unfortunately we're in a situation where there's so few people in the middle that people don't feel the need to talk to them.
Kate, we need to cover judges, and then we will get to our group's questions.
Help me, because I don't know what to do with judges.
Oh no, I'm so it's been interesting this year because this is the first time we've actually had judges running on a slate. And this is a fact that I always think it has to be wrong because it's so crazy. There had never been a public defender elected to the judge position before. It's always prosecutors who are running to become judges. So a group of public defenders, I think they're mostly women, maybe all women, got together and they call themselves the Defenders of Justice. And they just put out an ad today. They're running together as a slate. And they're encouraging voters that, hey, when you look at your ballot and you see a bunch of names, you don't know who anyone is, look for public defender and vote for the public defender, which I think is it's an innovative way to run because I was working on my ballot and you feel like you're doing good, like I know all this, and then you get to community college district and you're like, wait, what? I don't know any of these people. And I think a lot of people feel the same way about the judges, and you're going to their websites and you're trying to figure out who this person is. And it's just interesting that there is a group, and I think they are all women, who have decided to run together and kind of demystify and create a contrast between them and their opponent. I'm a public defender, I've been on the side of the accused, let's try something different and get judges that have a different experience with them. So it's been interesting.
And it is a fascinating experiment because all of us know what it's like when we start getting way too much mail before an election. And in addition to the mail from the candidates, I know you've all seen what's called a slate mailer, where instead of it being a piece of mail about one candidate, it lists several people. Because what they're assuming is you might know who's running for president or for governor or for senator or mayor, but you don't know who's running for these other offices, so you look at the slate mailer and say, wow, if I like Biden, then I guess I'll vote for these candidates. If I like Trump, then I'll vote for these candidates. If I like Caruso, then I'll vote for these candidates. If I vote like Bass, then I'll vote for these. And judges have generally either not participated in those slates or have been so far down them that they really don't get much notice. And for a group of judges or a group of judicial candidates on either side to say, we're going to come together and identify in a particular way, that sends just as strong a signal as a Democrat or a Republican. And so when it comes time to vote, these lower ticket offices, there's cues available to us that haven't been the case in the past. So like I said, we did start a little bit late.
Learned something new. I didn't know that. Interesting.
So there you go. So we did start a little bit late, but one of the things Susan and I have agreed on every time we've done this is that once I stop bloviating and once our smart panelists get a chance to weigh in, my favorite part of the program is when we start hearing questions from the really smart members of our audience. And so what I'd ask you to do for anybody who has any questions, either about anything that Kate or Alex or I have talked about, or something you're interested in that we've missed, just raise your hand. And we'll get in as many questions as we can over the next 15 minutes or so. And afterwards, I don't know, Alex has to get back to work and Kate has a 5-year-old at home. I'll be more than happy to stay around a little bit longer and answer anything we don't get to in the larger group. Let's start way in the back then.
Can't hear you.
The question is about Proposition 29?
So confusing, yes.
Okay. So Proposition 29 is an initiative that would require the operators of dialysis machines to have trained medical personnel, to have doctors on the premises when a patient is undergoing dialysis. This has been put on the ballot a few times before by organized labor because they see a potential benefit in this for their members. The people who operate dialysis clinics believe that this would raise the costs of providing dialysis to a level that many people would no longer be able to find affordable. And they argue that it's not necessary to have an MD on premises, that in fact, both the service being provided and if something were to go wrong, availability of emergency services is more than sufficient to make sure a patient in need gets the care they deserve. It's not our business to tell you how to vote on the initiatives, but what we've seen in California politics many times over the years is a group will put an initiative on the ballot, even knowing that they can't pass it, to try to get their opponents to spend a great deal of money. And the hope is that even if the initiative is defeated, if they come back to the ballot enough times, eventually the other side will get so tired of spending so many millions of dollars to beat it that they'll negotiate out a solution in the legislature. And so what you're seeing here now is an effort not really to pass an initiative about dialysis, but rather to get the owners of dialysis clinics and the unions who staff them to come to an agreement in the legislature with a compromise that makes sure that patients gets the care that they deserve.
And not necessarily that newspaper editorial board should sway your decision one way or another, but every single newspaper editorial board in the entire state are all advising you to vote no on Proposition 29.
The LA Times called it political extortion.
And I will say, in the interest of staying neutral, I've watched players on both sides do this over the years, both liberals and conservatives, saying, I can't get the other side to agree with me on legislation. So if I spend $1 million or so to qualify an initiative, and they have to spend $100 million to defeat it, if I do that 2 or 3 times, maybe I can get them to make a deal with me. And so this is a long-time trend we've seen from influencers on both sides of the aisle. I believe we saw a question here. Ma'am?
No, actually, that was my question.
That was your question on Prop 29? Ma'am?
I know the mayor's race sort of was very interesting. I'm really concerned about the county supervisors. You look at the amount of money controlled by, I don't understand about it, but the city, we're talking about what's been going on. But the county supervisors hold the purse strings, really, have a lot of power. And I'm in the Shield Tool district, but that's all been redistricted now. I'd like you guys to comment on that. And as an aside, I got a mailer today from a Planned Parenthood advocacy group, independent voter, supportive of Proposition 1, basically saying really horrendous cartoon about Bob Hertzberg, like an elephant with its trunk and making like he was. It was so offensive. I had to go online and look up and doing some investigation. Lindsay Horvath is basically supported by this group. They Planned Parenthood, whatever the advocacy group is. But she believes conception is the beginning of life. And I'm like, Planned Parenthood is plastered all over this, getting this mailer. I'm willing to look it up, but there's more here and I don't know what it is.
Okay, so,
Throw that out.
and I'm so glad you raised this because we got so caught up in talking local and state and federal politics, we skipped right over the county. And of course, many of us live in the new supervisorial district in which State Senator Bob Hertzberg and former West Hollywood Mayor Lindsay Horvath are running against each other. Seems like just a year ago, this was a campaign between Assemblymember Richard Bloom and State Senator Henry Stern, and then the world changed. Hertzberg has been a leader in the state legislature for more than 2 decades now. Horvath has gained great acclaim of the work she's done on the West Hollywood City Council and in the rotating mayoral position in that city. Kate, Alex, how would you handicap this race?
I would think that Hertzberg probably is a favorite in that race because he's got more money, he's been around longer, has more name recognition, and has more allies over the years because of that. I think he's a more moderate choice. Lindsay Horvath is a more progressive choice. But because Bob Hertzberg is an old white guy who's been around for a while too, there may be some people that want a different choice in that race. It's an interesting choice, but I think the sort of smart money politically, I don't know if you disagree, is that Hertzberg most likely wins.
Didn't
So wait, but
Newsom
just-
just endorse?
Hertzberg, yes.
Right,
Hertzberg.
yeah, yeah.
It's interesting, the governor has not endorsed in the race for LA mayor, but
Yeah.
he did endorse in the race for
Well, the
supervisor.
governor did not endorse in the race for LA mayor, saying, I don't like to get involved in Dem-on-Dem races. And then he got involved in a Dem-on-Dem race, which is Hertzberg versus Horvath. Now, Newsom and Hertzberg have worked very closely together on a lot of things, including gun safety legislation. Hertzberg was the guy that carried the bills that Newsom wanted. They actually are friends. Again, they also share a political advisor. So that wasn't hugely surprising. It just sort of once again showed that his rationale in the mayor's race didn't quite make sense.
So Kate, this is really interesting. Half an hour ago, we were talking about Rick Caruso's message that it's time for a change. Lindsay Horvath's message is, it's time for a change. I don't think they have very much else in common, except for the fact that they're both running against politics as usual from opposite ends of the political spectrum. How do you see this race?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see the Hertzberg, Lindsay Horvath race more. I see it more in terms of the generational differences in the Democratic Party. With, I think Elex was spot on. I mean, Hertzberg is a more moderate, older Democrat, more established, more connections, and Horvath is much, she is framing herself as more progressive. She was, trying to attack him in a debate, saying that he didn't come out strong enough for trans rights. I mean, she's definitely trying to be the more progressive, younger, millennial candidate in that race. And I would say there's a lot of differences between them in terms of, again, I cover the sheriff's department a lot as far as funding law enforcement, as far as building up, alternatives to incarceration, how the county is dealing with those issues around mental health. It's going to be huge, whoever gets in that chair. So they are very different candidates. So I think it's really just, the issues that matter to you.
And what's interesting about this progressive centrist balance is it's not just this one seat on the supervisors. While there are 4 Democrats and 1 Republican on the LA County Board of Supervisors, with Kuehl's retirement, the remaining 4 members are pretty much split 2 to 2.
Yeah.
2 progressives and 2 moderates.
Yeah.
So if Lindsay Horvath wins, you'll have a county board of supervisors controlled by progressives on a 3 to 2 vote on most issues. If Hertzberg wins, you'll see the moderates and the centrists with that same kind of power. We talked earlier about how the issues of crime and homelessness have so upended Los Angeles politics. But I think the other really interesting thing about the race between Horvath and Hertzberg is it points out to us how much more progressive California Democrats and Los Angeles Democrats have become over the last several years. I suggest if this race had taken place 10 years ago, Hertzberg would have won without much problem. And just like we said earlier, Caruso would have difficulty mounting a competitive campaign under more normal circumstances. Lindsay Horvath is benefiting from the trending in Los Angeles voting as well. Alex, I cut you off, I apologize.
Oh, no, I was cutting you off. I think if Hertzberg gets in there, that may be very bad news for the tenure of Barbara Ferrer as LA County Health Director. A couple of the, because I think that, well, we'll see what happens going forward, but I know that Catherine Barger and Janice Hahn have not been huge fans of the way that she's run that department. They have not had a third vote to potentially make a change there. Hertzberg has not really answered that question, but given signs that he may not be thrilled with that either, Horvath is more of a progressive in the school of Hilda Solis and Holly Mitchell. So which version of the council do you want? If you want a more progressive, more left council, Lindsay Horvath is the way to go. If you want a more moderate council, sort of check some of the progressive ideas, Bob Hertzberg's probably the way to go.
But we'll try to get in a couple of last questions before we wrap up. Yes, sir?
Excuse me. So I want to ask, this is probably off topic, which is typical for me. I'm a great socks.
Thank you.
What do you think, as political experts, what do you think our elected officials view, based on their conduct, as their primary mission? Is it to lead, or is it to get reelected? And that's a question, because you said it's time for a change. And if we have to change, we need people who are making decisions based on what's right and wrong, not what plays to my base. My base could be neo-Nazis. So why should I support national, so I'm just curious what you think.
So it's a great question series. I should just clarify. I was not saying it was time for a change. I was merely saying that both Rick Caruso and Lindsay Horvath were both using the same message. But I think the gentleman asks a fascinating question. Is voter disillusionment in politics and government certainly not helped by the events of the last 12 days? Is it all-time highs? We've been seeing steady trend downward ever since Watergate and the Vietnam War, but it's certainly accelerated in recent years. Question for either of you: do voters look at their politicians and see people who are representing the voters' interests, or do they see them in this for themselves?
Well, that's not what he asked. What he asked is, how do politicians see themselves, right? Which is, I think it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, I think there are a lot of politicians who, if they were really being honest with you behind closed doors, would say, if you don't get reelected, you can't accomplish any of the other stuff. So sometimes you got to moderate a little bit to keep yourself in the room where it happens, because you may not love Joe Biden, but you didn't like Donald Trump. And so Joe Biden is probably a more moderate version of the Democratic Party than a lot of people would like. There's people that maybe like Bernie Sanders, but Joe Biden's a whole lot better than Trump. And so they have to do certain things to position themselves and listen to the polls so that they can keep the other side from getting into power. And it's not always just pure right and wrong. A lot of times it's more complicated than that.
So Kate, I'm not going to ask you to name names, but do you see exceptions to that? Have you dealt with elected officials who you believe are genuinely motivated by public service? Or do most of those that you see fall into the category that Alex was just describing?
I think that most people get into public service because they're idealistic, because they're pissed off, because they want to make a change. The struggle is once you get in, once you win that first election, all of a sudden everything is a compromise, right? And it has been really fascinating for me, and particularly I became really on the ground with this wave of young, progressive candidates that were running in the wake of George Floyd in 2020. And a lot of those folks, they're millennials, they're in their early 30s, they're getting into office for the first time on these idealistic messages, we're gonna change the system. But then the big question becomes, once you're in that role, okay, now you're an assemblyman, now you're a council person, now you're a city attorney or whatever role it is. Every day you have to make compromises on your values in order to get things accomplished. You gotta raise money, you gotta keep on your seat. So there's just an inevitable change of motivation there. As idealistic as you start out in the beginning, like you do become part of this machine. And that leaked tape just confirmed, I think, everyone's worst idea of what those backroom conversations sound like. So I think that voters have a right to be upset and discouraged, but I do think that most people, when they get into politics, get in for the right reasons.
And you pick which hill to die on.
Yeah.
Sometimes. And sometimes you die. Like Liz Cheney picked a hill to die on, right? And now she's dead. Politically, at least. I mean, she can sleep at night, probably, right? And, you know, probably the way this room feels, she probably feels that she did the right thing and it was heroic. But now there's going to be a really, really conservative member of Congress from her district who's going to vote with Trump on everything, and that was a decision. Was that the right thing or the wrong thing? History probably will view her very kindly, but the counter to that is she lost.
Several years after, I had the wonderful opportunity to work with both Kate Cagle and Elex Michaelson as undergraduates at USC in the course I teach in political communications. For several years, I also taught a class of leadership. And every semester, one of the assignments the students would have to work on is to define political leadership. And almost every single semester, the definition they came up with was, a true political leader is someone who's willing to lose their seat in office in order to do the right thing. And that was almost unanimous. At which point, the very fierce debate, which you've just heard from Kate and Alex began, which is after they've done the honorable thing and are no longer in a position to do anything, have they done the right thing or the wrong thing? And I think Kate did a very good job of tracing the trajectory of politicians of both parties, even those who struggle to maintain their idealism, to realize that not just to stay in office, but to accomplish some of what they came to City Hall or Sacramento or Washington to do is something that they can complete.
Do you think Cedillo and KDL are listening right now to your definition of political leadership?
Yeah.
It's so interesting.
But to that,
We'll find out.
to that point though, and then I know there's more questions. That was the debate inside the Trump administration for a lot of people that worked for him, right? That there are clearly some true believers, but there were a lot of people that said, this shit's crazy. But they said, if I'm not here to protect some of this, it's going to get worse. And so then it became a, do you resign and protest, or do you stay and try to minimize the damage? And that's a really interesting question.
We are no surprise at all. We are way over time. But we've had one very patient gentleman, well, there's several other questions. We have one very patient gentleman in the back, so we'll let him ask the last question. And Kate and Alex, I know you need to move on, but for anyone else who'd like to continue talking more informally, I'm more than happy to discuss with you afterwards. So sir, you're going to be the last question.
Quickly, of the mayoral candidates, do you think it's going to make a difference in terms of the homeless issue, or who has a better handle, do you think, on making change after all of these years?
So for those of you who did not hear the gentleman's question, what he essentially said is, Ms. Cagle, Mr. Michaelson, I'd like you to violate your oath as journalists and take a position in this mayor's race. I'm kidding you, sir.
That was exactly what I said.
He asked a great question, which is, do you think either of these mayoral candidates, if elected, will be able to make a significant difference in this tremendous challenge of homelessness that our city's facing? That's not taking sides.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so is the answer. Bass's position is more one that's sort of, let's double down on the status quo a little bit, and let's try to get people towards permanent supportive housing, because just sort of moving people from encampment to encampment isn't really a solution. It's sort of her thing. We can go deeper into the weeds of it. Caruso's solution is more like, we got to get rid of these encampments. We may have to arrest people to do it. We're going to build a bunch of temporary beds, and we got to get this stuff off the streets. Are they either going to be able to accomplish that right away? No. It's expensive, it's complicated, it's nuanced, it's all of that. But I do think that whoever is mayor, either one of them, both of whom I really like personally, and I think are doing this for the right reasons, there's going to be a new energy in this city. I mean, Eric Garcetti is exhausted. And he's been trying to leave that job for like 3 years, at least. He talked about running for president in 2019 and was going to Iowa and testing it around, and then was thinking about being vice president, and then all these other, then India and all the rest of it. And most of the people that are on his team right now are like not the JV team, but like the Frosh Soft team. It's like people, all his best people left. Like they're just like running on empty in that office right now. And Eric Garcetti, a very nice guy who's worked hard, but like that place is just decimated. And I think whoever comes into that office, whether it be Bass or Caruso, will have a new energy, have an A-team around them of people that are motivated, excited, and focused on doing this. And I think as a result of that, there will be a fresh approach and a lot of want to do something big on it. I think Caruso given the way that he is, will be focused on the visual of it. Because this is a guy who creates beautiful places for people to go that sort of feel fantasy-like. I mean, the Grove is like Main Street, USA. And not a lot of homeless people at the Grove, right? It's like clean, and there's nice music and fountains. And I think in his mind, he's going to probably target a lot of the areas that are really visual and really touristy. And for Bass, she would say that all of her years of experience would be a more sophisticated approach that might actually solve the problem. So, I don't know.
I agree with Alex, and I think it's actually really exciting to the idea, either one of them, of getting someone fresh in the office who is energized, because I think you're right. Inevitably, Dan already talked about the fact that we have a weak mayor system. After a while, you are the guy in the ship with the bucket, and there's a hole in the boat. And you are the one who is trying as hard as you can to make a difference, but at the end of the day, homelessness, it is such an intractable issue. It has to do with cost of living, mental illness, drug addiction. It's going to take all layers of government, city. It's the county that runs the health department. It's the county that needs to build up an actual institution around mental health that we don't have. We have less than half the number of mental health beds in LA that you should have per capita. You cannot, people who are getting 5150'd, right, you're having a breakdown on the street, they can't even get the full hour holds that they're supposed to get right now. And that's a county issue. That has nothing to do with the mayor. So I just would hedge my bets on homelessness. And I agree with what Alex is saying. I think Caruso is going to be very focused on visuals, the encampments, doing what they can to maybe reduce the size of the encampments that we've seen. But I have seen so many cleanups. I went back to Olvera Street this week. I was there in November. They were cleaning up Olvera Street. They were moving people into housing. That street is covered in tents today. So I would just say, sorry, wah wah. But it's a hard issue. It's really hard.
In fairness to Eric Garcetti, I have never seen a mayor or a governor or a president in the 8th year of their term who had much energy left.
9th.
Because you're right, 9th year.
Well, that's
and frankly, if that president, governor, or mayor does their job, by 8 years they should be tired. Yeah. If they're rested and relaxed at the end of 8 or 9 years, that means they weren't putting in the time and effort they should have been. So this isn't unique for Garcetti. But I'll offer you this, and I think both Alex and Kate make brilliant points about what to watch for going forward. I'll offer one less brilliant point on this. So we are 19 days before an election. I have been voting in various cities at various levels for 40 years now. I have never, ever, ever been undecided on a vote I was going to cast 19 days before the election until this election for the mayor of Los Angeles. I still honestly have not made up my mind. Let me tell you why. As I mentioned earlier, and as Kate just referenced, Los Angeles is a weak mayor system. A lot of the power is vested in the city council. As Kate correctly pointed out, a lot of it is at the county level. As Alex correctly pointed out, a lot of it is mobilizing public opinion and interest. The greatest asset that a mayor of Los Angeles has, any mayor, is the bully pulpit. Their ability to talk to the people of Los Angeles and motivate them toward a particular goal or set of goals. I moved to California in the last few years of Tom Bradley's last term in office, so I did not see him at his apex. So since then, we've had 4 mayors. Dick Reardon, Jim Hahn, and Tony Villaraigosa, Eric Garcetti. And I would submit to you that the 2 most successful of those mayors were the 2 who were the most relentless in their use of the bully pulpit in much different ways, Reardon and Villaraigosa. Jim Hahn did the job the way it was prescribed very effectively, and no one noticed, and ultimately was not reelected. I think Garcetti, over the last 9 years, has had times when he's used that bully pulpit, and when he has, he's been at his best. So the question I ask myself is, which of these 2 individuals is better equipped to use this bully pulpit, not to magically make change, but to summon the people of Los Angeles to take on a seemingly intractable problem together? I'm not convinced either one has that skill set, but what I'm going to be watching for the next 19 days is to see which one I finally believe is better positioned to develop those skills when they're so necessary for a city that so desperately needs that brand of leadership. Far more important than that speech is a set of acknowledgments. First of all, to Rabbi Susan Nanis and the entire leadership team at Rosenberg. Because not just tonight, but for many years now, we've had these programs to come together and talk about not just elections, but all sorts of challenging issues because of Susan's work. So let's give her one more slightly more enthusiastic round. Let's also take a moment to thank my two amazing alums, these two incredible graduates who I watch every night on the news with incredible pride. Cagle on Spectrum, Elex Michaelson on Cagle. Not just for being here with us tonight, but for the work they do to keep the city of Los Angeles informed. As I told Kate before this program started, Kevin DeLeon, say what you will about him, is a very savvy man, and he knew better than to do an interview with either of them, because he knew that would have been a much, much tougher one to do.
And I want to
And
thank Dan Schnur for putting this together and all the
And more importantly than all the rest of those thank yous is to all of you. Because, as this gentleman talked about earlier, we are facing an extraordinary cynicism, not just in our community, but in our democracy. An incredible level of polarization and partisanship. And the way you get past those things is for people of good faith to come together, even if they don't agree on every issue or every candidate, to have a reasonable and rational conversation about the challenges we face. And the fact that you're here with us tonight to be part of that conversation gives me encouragement that no matter who becomes mayor of Los Angeles, we're moving in the right direction. So thank you all very much.
So he wrote